The delivery van pulled into the parking lot of Sterling Motors just after 2 p.m., its faded logo barely visible beneath years of highway dust. Walter Higgins stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing the same navy blue uniform he'd worn for the past 9 years. Comfortable, worn in, nothing special. At 67, he moved a little slower than he used to, but he still took pride in getting every delivery exactly where it needed to go, exactly on time. Today's delivery was simple, a small package of specialty detailing supplies, addressed to the service department in the back of the building. Nothing complicated. He'd made dozens of similar drop-offs at dealerships across the city over the years. Sterling Motors wasn't like most of them. It was the kind of luxury dealership where the floors gleamed like glass and the air smelled faintly of leather and money. Located in the city's upscale auto row, it specialized in rare, high-performance vehicles, the kind most people only saw in magazines or auction house catalogs. Walter had delivered here a handful of times before, always through the side entrance, always in and out within minutes. But today, the side entrance was blocked by a maintenance crew repainting the loading dock, forcing him to walk through the main showroom floor instead. He stepped inside, clipboard tucked under one arm, package balanced against his hip, and immediately understood why the place made people nervous. Underneath the soft showroom lighting sat 6 vehicles worth more than most houses, and at the center of the floor, elevated slightly on a rotating platform, sat the crown jewel of the entire dealership, rare 1967 hand-built prototype, one of only 3 ever produced, insured for more than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. Walter slowed his pace without meaning to, his eyes drawn to the car the way old habits sometimes surface without warning. Something about the engine bay access panel, visible through the raised hood display, caught his attention in a way that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. He didn't get more than a few seconds to look before a sharp voice cut across the showroom floor. "Excuse me, can I help you?" Walter turned to find a man in his early 40s approaching quickly, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, dealership badge reading Bradley Sinclair, general manager pinned neatly to his lapel. His tone wasn't a genuine offer of help. It was closer to an accusation. "Just making a delivery to the service department," Walter said calmly, holding up the small package. "Side entrance was blocked, so I came through here." Bradley's eyes swept over Walter's uniform, his worn shoes, the delivery van visible through the front windows, and something in his expression shifted into open disdain. "This is a showroom floor, not a loading dock," Bradley said, voice rising slightly, loud enough that 2 well-dressed customers browsing nearby glanced over. "We have clients here evaluating a 6-figure purchase. I can't have delivery drivers wandering through here like it's a warehouse." "I understand," Walter said, already turning to leave. "I'll just—" "No, let me be clear." Bradley cut him off, stepping directly into his path now, apparently unwilling to let the moment pass without making a point. "This car right here," he gestured toward the rotating platform, "is worth more than you'll make in your entire life. Do you understand the kind of image we're trying to maintain? I need you to leave through the front door immediately and use the loading entrance from now on, even if it's blocked. Have your dispatcher call ahead next time." The 2 customers nearby had stopped browsing entirely now, watching the exchange with visible discomfort. A young sales associate near the reception desk looked down at her computer screen, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Walter didn't argue. He simply nodded, the way he'd learned to do decades ago when confrontation served no purpose. "Understood. Sorry for the trouble." He turned to leave, package still in hand, but paused for just a moment beside the rotating platform, his gaze drifting once more toward the exposed engine bay of the rare prototype. Something in his expression flickered. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something closer to quiet recognition, the look of a man seeing an old photograph of someone he used to know. Bradley noticed the pause and scowled. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Walter said quietly and walked toward the exit without another word. He didn't see the older mechanic who had just stepped out from the service bay doorway, wiping grease from his hands, frozen mid-motion the second his eyes landed on Walter's face. The mechanic, a heavy-set man in his late 50s named Frank Delgado, stared for a long moment, disbelief spreading across his features. "No way," Frank muttered under his breath, watching Walter climb back into his delivery van through the showroom's front windows. "No way. That's not possible." He turned toward Bradley, who was already walking back toward his office, entirely unaware of what had just happened. "Bradley," Frank called out, hurrying across the showroom floor, voice tight with urgency. "That guy you just kicked out, do you have any idea who that was?" Bradley didn't even turn around. "Some delivery driver." "Why?" Frank stopped walking, staring at the rotating platform where the rare prototype sat gleaming under the showroom lights, the same engine bay Walter had paused to look at just moments before. "That," Frank said slowly, "was the man who built that engine." Frank stood motionless for several seconds, unable to take his eyes off the empty space where the delivery van had disappeared. Bradley laughed without even slowing his pace. "Built the engine?" he scoffed. "Frank, you've been breathing too many exhaust fumes." "I'm serious." Bradley finally stopped and turned around. "The man you just embarrassed wasn't just some delivery driver." Frank walked toward the prototype, his weathered hands resting lightly on the polished fender. "If I'm right," he looked at the exposed engine bay, "he's Walter Higgins." The name meant absolutely nothing to Bradley. It meant everything to Frank. 41 years earlier, the factory floor echoed with the sounds of pneumatic tools, welding torches, and roaring engines being tested for the very first time. Unlike the company's regular production cars, the prototype program was different. Every engine was assembled by hand. Every component was measured twice. Every bolt was torqued by the same engineer from beginning to end. The company believed a machine built with care carried the personality of the people who created it. Among dozens of brilliant engineers, one stood above the rest: Walter Higgins. He wasn't famous because he wanted attention. He was famous because impossible mechanical problems somehow became solvable whenever they reached his workbench. Engineers joked that Walter could hear an engine think. If a vibration appeared that instruments couldn't detect, Walter found it. If horsepower disappeared somewhere inside the block, Walter found it. If a prototype refused to cooperate, they called Walter. Not because he was the oldest, because he was the best. One afternoon, the chief engineer rolled an unfinished aluminum engine block onto Walter's workstation. "This one matters." Walter looked over the blueprints. Prototype Series 7. A completely experimental power plant. No assembly manual. No production specifications. Every decision would be made by the engineers building it. Walter smiled. "I've been waiting for something interesting." For nearly 3 weeks, he barely left the workshop. He polished bearing surfaces by hand, balanced the crankshaft repeatedly until its tolerance measured almost impossibly close to perfection, adjusted valve timing again and again until the engine ran smoother than anyone believed possible. When the prototype finally came alive, the room fell silent. The engine didn't simply start. It purred. No rattles. No hesitation. Just effortless mechanical harmony. One executive whispered, "I've never heard anything like that." Walter simply wiped his hands with a shop towel. "It still has room to improve." Months later, the prototype stunned everyone during private testing. It produced more power than projected, better fuel efficiency, greater reliability. The company considered building a limited production run. Then everything changed. A global recession hit the industry. Budgets disappeared. Projects were canceled. Executives changed. The prototype program was shut down almost overnight. Only 3 completed vehicles survived. The rest were dismantled. Walter never complained. He packed his tools, shook everyone's hand, went home. He believed another opportunity would eventually come. It never did. Only weeks after leaving the company, Walter's wife received devastating medical news. Treatment became expensive. Insurance covered almost nothing. Walter was offered consulting jobs overseas, high-paying engineering positions, prestigious research opportunities. He declined every one. His wife needed him more than engines did. For nearly 12 years, he cared for her every single day. Hospital visits, medication schedules, physical therapy, late-night emergencies. When she passed away, Walter was already approaching retirement age. The automotive industry had moved on. New engineers, new technology, new management. His reputation slowly disappeared. Not because he had failed, because time has a way of erasing even remarkable people. He never tried to reclaim his former career. Instead, he accepted a job delivering automotive parts. It paid the bills, kept him moving, allowed him to stay close to the machines he had always loved. Most customers never asked about his past. Walter never volunteered it. Back in the present, Frank hurried into the dealership archives. Sterling Motors had inherited decades of factory documents after purchasing the brand's historical collection years earlier. Most employees never touched the files. Frank had. He knew exactly where to look. Dust rose as he pulled heavy binders from metal shelves. Prototype Program. Series 7. Engine Assembly Records. His fingers moved faster with every page. Then, he found it. Engine number. S7-003. The exact serial number displayed beneath the prototype in the showroom. Assembler. Walter James Higgins. Primary Calibration Engineer. Walter James Higgins. Final Performance Certification. Walter James Higgins. Frank stared at the page. His heart pounded. There it was. A small handwritten symbol beside the signature. A tiny engraved W. Walter's personal assembly mark. Almost invisible. Unknown to nearly everyone. But collectors had spent decades searching for engines bearing that mark because it guaranteed authenticity. Frank whispered, "My God." Meanwhile, Bradley sat comfortably inside his glass office, sipping expensive coffee, while speaking with two sales consultants. "I don't care how polite they seem." He pointed toward the showroom. "Delivery people use the service entrance." One salesman nodded awkwardly. Bradley continued, "This dealership sells exclusivity." He smiled proudly. "Appearances matter." Before anyone could answer, the receptionist hurried toward his office. "Mr. Sinclair?" She sounded nervous. "There's someone here asking about the prototype." Bradley straightened his tie. "Excellent." A distinguished man entered the showroom, wearing a tailored navy suit. Behind him walked two assistants, carrying leather document cases. Every employee recognized the logo embroidered on their jackets. It belonged to the original manufacturer, the company itself. The visitor introduced himself calmly. "My name is Richard Lawson." He extended his hand. "I oversee heritage certification for our collector division." Bradley's smile widened immediately. "What an honor. How can we help you today?" Richard looked directly at the rotating prototype. "We've received inquiries from several international collectors interested in purchasing this vehicle." He paused. "But before any transaction can proceed," his expression became serious. "We must verify whether the engine remains completely original." Bradley answered confidently. "Of course it is." Richard slowly shook his head. "Documentation isn't enough." He opened one of the leather folders. "For this particular prototype." He looked back at the engine. "Only one living engineer can personally verify the final assembly." The showroom suddenly felt much quieter. Richard asked a simple question. "Can you contact Walter Higgins?" Across the room, Frank slowly closed the archive binder. His face had turned pale. Because only minutes earlier, the dealership had thrown Walter Higgins out the front door. For several long seconds, no one in the showroom said a word. Bradley forced a polite smile, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. "I'm sorry," he said. "Did you say only one engineer?" Richard Lawson nodded. "Only one." He walked toward the prototype, stopping beside the open engine bay. This wasn't a production vehicle. His fingers hovered above the polished valve cover, without touching it. Every critical component was individually fitted. The tolerances were handwritten. The calibration wasn't performed by a computer. It was performed by a man. He looked directly at Bradley. And that man was Walter Higgins. Bradley's smile began to fade. "I'm sure we can verify everything through factory records." Richard slowly shook his head. "Normally, yes. But this engine is different." He opened another folder and removed several aging photographs. One showed a much younger Walter standing beside the unfinished prototype. Another showed him working over the engine with measuring tools spread across the workbench. A third captured the moment the completed power plant was lowered into the chassis. Richard placed the photographs on the desk. "The collectors already have copies. They know who built this engine. What they need now is confirmation that the engine has never been altered." Bradley swallowed. "And only Walter can do that?" Richard nodded once. "He designed several assembly techniques that were never written into the official manuals. He left small identification marks inside the engine that only he knows how to locate. If he confirms they're still there," he smiled, "the vehicle becomes one of the most valuable surviving prototypes in existence." Frank stepped forward. "He was here." Richard turned. "What?" "He walked through this showroom less than 20 minutes ago." Richard's eyes widened. "You spoke to him?" Frank hesitated. I did. Then he glanced toward Bradley. He didn't. Every face in the showroom slowly turned toward the general manager. Bradley's stomach tightened. What exactly are you saying? Frank answered quietly. The delivery driver was Walter Higgins. Silence. Complete silence. Bradley's mind replayed the encounter. The worn uniform. The old delivery van. Walter's calm voice. His brief pause beside the engine. The strange look of recognition. Then, the words Bradley himself had spoken. This car is worth more than you'll make in your entire life. His face drained of color. Oh, he whispered. Oh no. Within minutes, the dealership's owners were called. They arrived faster than anyone expected. Margaret Collins, the dealership's majority owner, entered first, followed by her business partner, David Mercer. Both had been informed only that there was an urgent issue involving the prototype. Richard explained everything from the beginning. Walter Higgins, the original engineer, the authentication, the collector's waiting, the importance of preserving the vehicle's documented history. When he finished, Margaret turned to Bradley. Where is Mr. Higgins? Bradley couldn't answer immediately. Finally, I asked him to leave. Margaret frowned. You asked him to leave? Bradley stared at the floor. I thought he couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Frank did it for him. You thought he was just a delivery driver. Nobody defended Bradley. Nobody even looked surprised. Because everyone working there had witnessed what happened. The receptionist lowered her eyes. The young salesperson who had watched from her desk quietly nodded. Even two customers who had remained inside the showroom exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them finally spoke. You were pretty harsh. Bradley closed his eyes. Every word hurt because it was true. Richard continued examining the prototype. Then, he pointed toward a tiny brass identification plate mounted near the firewall. This serial number has always puzzled collectors. Frank leaned closer. I know why. He reached into a cabinet and removed an inspection mirror. Sliding it carefully beneath the intake manifold, he angled the mirror toward the rear of the engine block. There. Richard bent down. His breath caught. Hidden where almost nobody would ever look, barely visible beneath decades of careful preservation, was a tiny engraved letter. A single W. Richard smiled. He really built it. Frank nodded. And that's only the first mark. There are supposed to be 3. Richard looked impressed. You know about them? Frank laughed softly. I apprenticed under Walter for 6 months. I wasn't good enough to stay. But I never forgot what he taught me. Richard looked back at the engine. Without Walter confirming the remaining marks, we cannot complete certification. He turned toward Margaret. I'm afraid the collectors won't move forward until they speak with him personally. Margaret didn't hesitate. Then we find him. Across the city, Walter continued his route as though nothing unusual had happened. He delivered brake pads, oil filters, boxes of spark plugs. He smiled politely at mechanics who thanked him, signed invoices, drank coffee from a faded thermos. The humiliation at Sterling Motors had already been pushed aside. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him by his uniform. Over the years, he had learned that people often saw clothing before they saw character. He refused to let bitterness become part of his life. His next stop was a small independent repair shop. The owner greeted him with a grin. Morning, Walter. Afternoon, Sam. You still carrying that old thermos? Walter laughed. It still keeps coffee hot. Sam handed him a receipt. You know, my grandson finally rebuilt that old Mustang. Walter smiled. Did he solve the ignition problem? He did. Thanks to the advice you gave him. Walter simply nodded. Glad it helped. To Walter, it was just another conversation. He had no idea that across town, an entire luxury dealership was desperately trying to find him. Back at Sterling Motors, the atmosphere had completely changed. Phones rang nonstop. Employees searched old delivery invoices. Security reviewed camera footage to identify the name printed on the delivery van. The receptionist found the signed delivery manifest. Her eyes widened. I found him. Everyone rushed toward her desk. She held up the paperwork. Delivery company. Metro Auto Supply Logistics. Driver. Walter J. Higgins. Bradley grabbed his car keys. I'll go. Margaret stopped him immediately. No. He looked confused. You've done enough. She took the keys from his hand. If anyone is going to ask for Mr. Higgins' forgiveness,